Curious Cats. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog. I'm joined by that person who has recently been dubbed quite cleverly in our comments section, Tim Rude as Hell. And the subject today is going to be this book, sort of. The anchor for the discussion today will be this book, Domestic Manners of the Americans by Frances Trollope. I don't know that I've ever heard a more inauspicious name for a woman. She came over to the United States around about 1829, I think, and stayed 1830, 31, somewhere in that range. She basically came in through the port of New Orleans and then went up the Mississippi. I believe she ended up in Memphis for a bit and has a rather colorful picture to paint of West Tennessee at this time, again, around 1830. So very early on when Memphis was the far west. From there, she went further north, ended up in Cincinnati, and then headed across the Appalachians, ended up in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia. And she makes a number of observations about America and Americans at the time that are very interesting to me. I had often talked with Tim in the past about, what America used to be like, or, what the original idea was for certain things, or, what lay behind this or that tradition or practice. And he would always, share with me some kind of weird insight. And I'd be like, how the hell do you know that? I mean, it would ring true and, it would be borne out. And he would generally turn to me and say, because I fucking read period accounts. And so I myself have endeavored to do so. Hence my interest in this book by Miss Trollope, who's something of a bourgeoisie bitch, if truth be told. Being a member of the lettered English middle classes, and a woman, well aware of the value of such things as Wollstonecraftism. But it's interesting. And so I would like to jump through, if I may, Tim, some of these passages that I have here and use them as a basis for discussing whatever comes to mind, whatever they trigger within your mind or mine.
Stroll with your Trollope.
It's taken me back. Any number of decades of my life have been spent with that pastime.
Yes, there's nothing quite like a good sachet with one's Trollope. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have a passage here where she is, I believe, in West Tennessee, and she is traveling about to, survey the domestic manners of these Americans, and she ends up out at a remote farm, and the story goes something like this. We visited one farm which interested us particularly from its wild and lonely situation, and from the entire dependence of the inhabitants upon their own resources. It was a partial clearing in the very heart of the forest. The house was built on the side of a hill so steep that a high ladder was necessary to enter the front door, while the back one opened against the hillside. At the foot of this sudden eminence ran a clear stream, whose bed had been deepened into a little reservoir just opposite the house. A noble field of Indian corn stretched away into the forest on one side, and a few half-cleared acres, with a shed or two upon them, occupied the other, giving accommodation to cows, horses, pigs, and chickens innumerable. Immediately before the house was a small potato garden, with a few peach and apple trees. The house was built of logs, and consisted of 2 rooms, besides a little shanty or lean-to that was used as a kitchen. Both rooms were comfortably furnished with good beds, drawers, etc. The farmer's wife and a young woman who looked like her sister were spinning, and 3 little children were playing about. The women told me that they spun and wove all the cotton and woolen garments of the family, and knit all the stockings. Her husband, though not a shoemaker by trade, made all the shoes. She manufactured all the soap and candles they used, and prepared her sugar from the sugar trees on the farm. All she wanted with money, she said, was to buy coffee, tea, and whiskey, and she could get enough any day by sending a batch of butter and chicken to market. They used no wheat, nor sold any of their corn, which, though it appeared a very large quantity, was not more than they required to make their bread and cakes of various kinds, and to feed all their livestock during the winter. She did not look in health, and said they all had ague in the fall, but she seemed contented, and proud of her independence, though it was in somewhat a mournful accent that she said, "'Tis strange to us to see company. I expect the sun may rise and set 100 times before I shall see another human that does not belong to the family." I have been minute in the description of this forest farm, as I think it the best specimen I saw of the backwoods independence, of which so much is said in America. These people were indeed independent. Robinson Crusoe was hardly more so, and they eat and drink abundantly. But yet it seemed to me that there was something awful and almost unnatural in their loneliness. No village bell ever summoned them to prayer, where they might meet the friendly greeting of their fellow men. When they die, no spot sacred by ancient reverence will receive their bones. Religion will not breathe her sweet and solemn farewell upon their grave. The husband or father will dig the pit that is to hold them beneath the nearest tree. He will himself deposit them within it, and the wind that whispers through the boughs will be their only requiem. But then they pay neither taxes nor tithes, are never expected to pull off a hat or make a curtsy, and will live and die without hearing or uttering the dreadful words, "God save the King." So, what are your thoughts on that one?
So far, it sounds pretty damn good.
Not to say what's to complain about there, despite her rejection of the entire picture. My main question is, what the hell happened to these people? Where are they today?
Well, they reproduced and made things better for their children. Better, i.e., in the way of closer connection with the communities. They made the whole thing better. They encouraged any number of activities. You notice that she did not mention a slave anywhere in the recital, and she would have. She did mention horses and cows and chickens and things. So she'd have mentioned a slave had there been one.
And she does elsewhere in the book, but yes, not with these frontiers folk.
Frontiers folk. Western Tennessee, you say? Out around Memphis, Yes. Yes, indeed. They made things better, Ollie. They cleared the acreage. They cut down the trees. From such cabins, chateaux were built. Houses were built. Any number of things were manufactured by them. This state of freedom did not last long, especially in Western Tennessee. They only in the state of standing on your own 2 feet and being divorced from such things as taxes and tithes and the horrors of God save the king or the president or whatever, can such people exist. That's all there is to it, old son. You have man in a state of civilization, but in a state of independence. That is Jefferson's yeoman farmer that she speaks of there. The freeman able to stand on his own 2 feet, on his own parcel of land, and tell everybody else to go piss up a rope.
Well, it is fundamentally American, is it not?
Listen, honey, is it American? And as such, to be stamped out whenever found.
Well, I begin to understand better and better. You're looking forward to that time when rednecks make it into space.
That's it. It sure is. Rednecks in space. I bet you I can.
Well, then,
wonder what happens if you hook this up.
Hey, fellas, watch this.
Yeah.
And what's the other one in that canon? Oh, hold my beer.
Hold my beer.
Well, on the subject of the class differences, which we've discussed before, I think in a recent clip I was telling you that, despite the fact that we seem to speak a language that is deceptively close to theirs, there are great differences between the Americans and the inhabitants of the British Isles. And
indeed so.
This particular passage is an entertaining one. She's referring to when she takes a house at various times, the difficulties that she has in taking a house. There are, this tale she tells about Cincinnati, where she tried to take a room, but she got tired of how everybody ate together when she was boarding at this house, and so she wanted to take tea in her room. And the owner of the home came up and said, you'll be eating with us or you won't be staying with us. Essentially saying we won't have any of your pretensions and posturing.
Yes.
But this is a passage about the trouble she ran into when she was taking houses out in the country that she thought lovely. In one of them, she talks about how she marched up a hill because it was so beautiful, and then silly ass got lost in the woods and spent the entire day trying to find her way back to her house. But and this is in the Ohio forests.
But, the Ohio forest, my goodness.
Yeah, once upon a time. But this is a passage about running into the other folks who live around her when she took a house for a time. The extraordinary familiarity of our poor neighbors startled us at first, and we hardly knew how to receive their uncouth advances, or what was expected of us in return. However, it sometimes procured very laughable scenes. Upon one occasion, 2 of my children set off upon an exploring walk up the hills. They were absent rather longer than we expected, and the rest of our party determined upon going out to meet them. We knew the direction they had taken, but thought it would be as well to inquire at a little public house at the bottom of the hill if such a pair had been seen to pass. A woman, whose appearance more resembled a Covent Garden market woman than anything else I can remember, came out and answered my question with the most jovial good humor in the affirmative, and prepared to join us in our search. Her look, her voice, her manner were so exceedingly coarse and vehement that she almost frightened me. She passed her arm within mine, and to the inexpressible amusement of my young people, she dragged me on, talking and questioning me without ceasing. She lived but a short distance from us, and I am sure intended to be a very good neighbor, but her violent intimacy made me dread to pass her door. My children, including my sons, she always addressed by their Christian names, excepting when she substituted the word honey. This familiarity of address, however, I afterwards found was universal throughout all ranks of the United States. My general appellation amongst my neighbors was the English old woman. But in mentioning each other, they constantly employed the term lady. They evidently had a pleasure in using it, for I repeatedly observed that in speaking of a neighbor, instead of saying Mrs. Such a one, they described her as the lady over the way what takes in washing, or as that there lady out by the gully what's making dip candles. Mr. Trollope was as constantly called the old man, while draymen, butchers' boys, and laborers on the canal were invariably denominated them gentlemen. Nay, we once saw one of the most gentlemanlike men in Cincinnati introduce a fellow in dirty shirt-sleeves and all sorts of detestable etc. to one of his friends with this formula: "Dear such and such, let me introduce this gentleman to you." Our respective titles certainly were not very important, but the eternal shaking hands with these ladies and gentlemen was really an annoyance, and the more so as the near approach of the gentleman was always redolent of whiskey and tobacco.
What did you wish to talk about that?
Well, whence comes this invasive familiarity? I myself am beginning to think that I might be a priggish little bitch, in the sense that it annoys the hell out of me when people want to come and knock on my door and talk to me about things. And yet it seems
they're taking advantage of the way things used to be. Things like that used to be that way because, to be honest with you, people were a little rarer on the ground, and you couldn't really tell in America what anybody was worth in the way that you could in England by their attire or their way of speaking. Yes. Everybody in America was equal, you see. Didn't have all this nonsense about, oh, he was born here, he went to school there, he da-da-da-da-da. That was pretty much the Eastern. Now, in Ohio, she was still in the Western. You see, Western portion of the country. It was not Wild West, as it had been just a few years before, but it was still pretty wild. And there were still Indians around.
Yeah, and she mentions one time going out to a site where this woman who had decided she was going to do something for slaves had set up a special school for them. This was in Tennessee. And there's a point where the black coachman is trying to take them to this site, and she's flipping the fuck out because he just looks over at her and smiles, says, "Well, looks like the stream's a little high, ma'am." And he whips the horses forward into the river to ford it. And the water's, of course, coming up over the sides of the wagon. And she's also talking about the height at which the stumps are cut, which is just barely enough to provide clearance for the axle of the wagons. And, this is heading out to an undertaking, a construction site that's supposed to be, like a school. And yet it's very wild by our standards today.
By our standards today. It wasn't wild by their standards then. The real thing that you have to understand is that the majority of people in the nation now are not descended from what you would call settlers. That's what these people were. They were settlers. They're descended from immigrants, which is an entirely different group of people. Immigrants came from Europe, etc., with expectations and settled in the cities. They moved from the cities to the suburbs. They moved across the country in a vast wave of resettlement and resettlement and resettlement that bore no relationship to the nature of the settlers who were there and basically defended what they had from the Indians, or defended what they had from the wildlife. People have no idea what bears, wolves, deer, huge masses of these animals can do to a garden.
Or when the birds get in your crop. And the result is you starve, and it's nothing but birds.
Stone the crows, old son. Yes, indeed, they do. And the thing is that whole different mindset. Now, my people were settlers. All right? They came here, my mother's side of the family, and settled in South Carolina. They settled in North Carolina. They settled eventually in Florida. My father's people were Germanic, and they settled in Pennsylvania for religious reasons, and then moved to North Carolina and throughout the country. The whole thing is they're settlers. See, I can be bitten by a brown recluse spider, and instead of a usurpating wound that degenerates and the flesh breaks down and liquefies and all that sort of thing, and I'm in terrible shape, I get a yellow-black blister-looking thing that doesn't ever really blister, and then it goes away. Because everybody in my line who has been here long enough to marry, reproduce, and so on, all of them that were sensitive to that sort of thing died off.
Yeah, I also think it has something to do with tobacco use as well. I started thinking about the heavy-ass tobacco use through, my lines, and then you start reading the texts from the period, and it seems that, everyone was drinking whiskey and spitting out chewing tobacco everywhere. She just talks about it constantly. And so I think that gives us, our bodies, a slightly different way of dealing with it maybe than populations that haven't been using tobacco for, in their lives for a couple hundred years.
We developed an immunity, so to speak, to summer fever, ague. We used to have malaria and all sorts of things here. It killed off any number of people. People always talk about how the white man brought these diseases to the Indian, that the Indian had no way to get their immune system up to it. Well, the fucking Indian had shit too. And a lot of us died.
Yeah, the syphilis, of course, comes to mind immediately.
Well, listen, honey.
So a wee bit of syphilis here and there.
A wee bit of syphilis, Nothing like being able to run your finger through your nose. But at any rate.
Yeah, and have the whole front end of it fall off. Yeah.
Oh, well, now let's not get too carried away with
Let's not get too tertiary. Yes.
Yes. No, the thing is, the Indians had a lot of shit that we didn't have. A lot of people turned up their toes and died when they came over here. In effect, if you had 100 fucking settlers, when they first got off the boat, you might have 10 or 15 in a year or so.
Yeah, especially if you came into New Orleans.
Well, now, New Orleans was a different thing entirely. New Orleans had everything and some more shit, too. Had everything the Spanish could bring with them, everything the French could bring with them, everything 3 or 4 different Indian tribes could bring in. And then you had the occasional Englishman that came through. All just god-awful, in mud in the streets, a good foot deep.
Oh, yeah, she talks about that. I mean, of course, you're talking about New Orleans, which is highly civilized, advanced, and developed by comparison, but she talks about arriving in Memphis by comparison to Memphis at the same time, and she's just talking about trying to climb up from the docks, where the steamboat drops her off on the Mississippi, and she's heading up to the settlement up at the top of this hill and just up to her knees in mud. And this is an English woman with her fancy traveling clothes, and, she's falling down onto her face,
Sure. Yeah. Thing is that in New Orleans, she wouldn't have fallen on her face going uphill. She'd have fallen on her face going downhill, uphill, around the hill, all kinds of things, because there aren't any hills in New Orleans. It's all flat. It's a fucking mangrove swamp is what it is. One that the Spanish and then the French just dried out a little bit. I mean, my God, man, let's be honest about it. They got to have pumps to pump the water up to the levees.
Yes, and as we've talked about before, that favorite expression all my New Orleans family enjoys so much, you walk outside, it's like walking into a mouth, cher. It's just horrifically humid and hot. But this whole time seems to be a very, very interesting one, because we assume, that we're so enlightened and we've developed so much tolerance, and it's all about tolerance, and everything in terms of ideology and different perspectives. We assume that it was this horrific situation in America where everyone was forced to buy some line or another or toe it, and in reality it appears it was a very different place. This one passage is quite interesting to me. I'm going to just give you a little piece of it because it's rather long, but it points out the freedom of belief, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom to speak your mind. She writes, "It was in the early summer of this year, 1829, that Cincinnati offered a spectacle unprecedented, I believe, in any age or country. Mr. Owen of Lanark, of New Harmony of Texas, well known to the world by all or either of these editions, had challenged the whole religious public of the United States to discuss with him publicly the truth or falsehood of all the religions that had ever been propagated on the face of the earth, stating further that he undertook to prove that they were all equally false and nearly all equally mischievous. This most appalling challenge was conveyed to the world through the medium of New Orleans newspapers, and for some time it remained unanswered. At length, the Reverend Alexander Campbell, from Bethany, not of Judea, but of Kentucky, proclaimed through the same medium that he was ready to take up the gauntlet. The place fixed for this extraordinary discussion was Cincinnati, the time the second Monday in May, 1829, being about a year from the time the challenge was accepted, thus giving the disputants time to prepare themselves." So,
yeah,
she basically describes how these people get up and speak civilly to one another.
Yeah.
And in an informed way, and without foaming or frothing.
No.
And how the public For the most part, very religious from everything that I've read here and that
Oh, yes,
we'll
very.
touch upon in some other places, other contexts. They sit and watch these guys talk for a few hours in a very civilized way.
Yes.
And so you've got a room full of these intensely religious people. Now, some of them might be Quakers, some of them might be Shakers, some of them might be Catholics, some of them might be Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, whatever. And yet they're all sitting in this, yes, indeed, all sitting in this room more than willing to listen to someone discuss how Christianity is not only false, but mischievous.
Yes.
How is it that we can imagine today that the United States is so much more advanced and so much more tolerant?
Have you ever looked at the educations that these people were subjected to?
Oh, today.
No. Then.
Well, Trollope discusses what she dismisses as their superficiality, in the sense that all these Americans seem to be fascinated with newspapers and magazines and seem to be addicted to the news. Yes, but not in the sense where she's talking about, though of course the sense you're talking about does exist, but not in the sense that they are literati and familiar with the canon. Many of them she mocks because they're not as familiar with the classics, but they all read constantly for the things like the news and politics.
You know, the most popular books, two of them, were in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary households.
Other than the Bible, no.
Bible, yes, very good book. Shakespeare, 1-volume editions of Shakespeare were big, containing his poems, his plays. 1-volume editions. People would read them. People would trade books. Now, I will say to you that quite often these people from Harvard and so on would come out to be teachers. And they would teach. And they would teach Latin. They would teach English. They would teach Greek. They would teach mathematics. They would teach all of the things that one needed to know. The idea that somebody, anybody, anywhere, could be uneducated is based on the idea of Miss Trollope. You see, in other words, snobbery. Not literati, you know. Yeah, you get some old mountain man up in there and he's cogitating upon William Shakespeare, because this is the sort of English that he would probably speak.
Much closer
Shakespearean
to it, sure.
English, yes.
And that's not taking into account things like the Tidewater accents, which were certainly very alive in the 1820s.
Indeed they were. Now, I will say to you that the further west you went, believe it or not, the more the people from the east came out. They had to. You are familiar with what Daniel Boone said about he was too close to his neighbors when he hear the sound of their axe?
I believe I
Hear the
recall that.
sound of their axe. Not see them, not smell them. Hear the sound of their axe. Now that's I'm going to tell you, because I live in the country, that to not be able to hear the sound of somebody's axe being swung around, you got to be a good piece off from them. A good piece, couple of miles. Now, that's as the crow flies, because that's how sound travels, just like the crow flies. Now, I will tell you that, in effect, these people sitting around listening to this and being willing to entertain the ideas as rational constructs depends and depended upon the inability of anyone to make you believe a damn thing, because it was all your decision, your choice. Nobody else's, yours. Now, we got into a little trouble with the Mormons a little later in the game, because the Mormons decided they were going to enforce their ideas upon people. The Mormons were some of the first collectivists, as you can tell from the way they lived. It's that way. That was when we had all the trouble with Joseph Smith and throwing him in jail and doing them all.
Moving further and further westward as each of the communities they tried to drop into, said,
No, we're not having that. You're not forcing anything on us. So they got out to where they could force it on people with the avenging angels and all that sort of nonsense.
And the state of Utah remains dominated by them to this day.
My goodness, Ollie, you don't mean that. Yeah, indeed so. But you see, collectivism was the thing that nobody wanted. The vast majority of settlers to this place brought with them the idea that it was better to take a chance on being killed, being dead, than being forced into anything. And that, my friend, is what we're missing today. The idea that you can get up and say anything you want, and I can listen to you because, golly gee, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to agree with it at all.
Yeah, there's a passage I mentioned to you, just before the call, where she is talking to someone that she does believe deserves the title of literati, right? I believe it's in Philadelphia, and he's an educated man, what she refers to as in America as someone who's gentleman-like. And she's saying something or another about some party or person or group of people who've been doing something or another, and she mentions this business of how they think and their attitudes and beliefs, and this guy who she's kind of set herself up with, because she's seen him as being acceptable, yet he turns to her and says, thankfully, madame, unlike Europe and these other places, here in America, we don't really care what anyone thinks. And
Indeed,
you've got
so.
this fundamental notion that part of the freedom of being an American is the freedom not to give a shit if you disagree with someone. And that, I think, is something that the collectivists have driven back. Of course, all this, to me, brings to mind this sort of vague idea of what I'm dubbing anti-socialism, in the sense, it's a cuteness, but it does sort of encapsulate this idea that, socialism can fuck off. Unfortunately, it does seem to be the thing of the future, but there is perhaps a hint of how all of this came to be in the United States included in her text. She discusses at every turn these revivals that would be undertaken. Now, some of them would be in churches. Others would be out in the country at night. And some of the spectacles she describes are just astounding. There's one she talks about where they all come together with wagons out in the forest. And this thing goes on for days in the woods. And they raise altars up, like in the four directions, and light bonfires on top. And in the midst of this forest clearing with like bonfires at the cardinal directions, these crowds are harangued by preachers about there coming death and judgment and all these other things. And according to this woman's descriptions, they're just sort of, many times you've got crowds of young women. And she remarks again and again and again and again on the attendance in the churches of these well-dressed young women. and how they make up almost a majority in the congregations,
Mm-hmm.
and the interest of the women in religion in the United States is just being fucking overwhelming. And these same women tend to go into all these contortions and writhings of like fear of judgment and all these things that we would have, described perhaps from, the 1850s up to the 1930s as hysterics, coming from this idea of the hysterum, hysteria, whatever, the womb itself, right? So it seems that there is this enormous latent cohort of religiously interested females, and from her description, ones who are all kinds of twisted up with sexual tension, and who find an outlet for it in collective feminine moralization. And she goes on in another passage to discuss this strangeness. She ran into a guy who, maybe he was he was definitely German, maybe he was even a staymaker, but he made the mistake in polite company, as he relates to her in their private discussion. Among other Americans, he made the mistake of mentioning the word corset in good company, and was met with this shock. And so we see here the seed forms of the social justice warrior, of the middle-class females with sexual tension that is not provided an outlet, who kind of smolder looking at the handsome new priest who's come to town. Oh, let's all go and have tea with Miss So-and-so who's boarding up the priest. We'll all have a chance. And they arrive with their bonnets on and their best clothes to all sit and titter at the attractive young priest.
You're confusing your caste, old son. Confusing them.
Well, the thing is that she talks about these revivals in the forest of the sort that I described, but she also talks about them in the cities and the churches, and they're almost as, orgiastic.
But you see, the ones in the forest are differently orgiastic. Does she describe the men and what they're up to?
There just seem to be fewer of them, and she doesn't focus on them.
No, she wouldn't. She wouldn't at all. Because they're off drinking.
Well, no, she does mention that.
Chewing tobacco.
Chewing tobacco and drinking whiskey. The two scourges upon our nation, as she puts it.
Indeed so. And these women are looking for a man, and if they can't find one, then they get all carried away in this orgiastic ritual. Have you ever looked at how many marriages there were in those days?
Not in any kind of systematic way.
You ought to. I commend it to your attention.
You mean in terms of the overall percentage, people who were and were not married?
Yes.
And what am I likely to see there?
Well, now that will be a tale in itself, won't it?
Well, then. Homework. All right, God damn it. Well,
yes, indeed.
Does it seem reasonable?
For a reason. Because a lot of the men died or were killed. A lot of the men weren't available. There were more women than men. But the women picked through the men.
And yet, for every indication I've seen from this woman's descriptions, like, for example, the steamboats running up and down the Mississippi were entirely segregated. So even, getting on board, a man who is married would only be able to see his wife at brief intervals when they would meet in the eating room, but otherwise they roomed entirely separately. And from everything she describes, she complains about it constantly, that the Americans are not cosmopolitan like the Europeans, and that the men and women...
The Americans didn't have the room to have rooms for all of these couples. Did she tell you about the sleeping arrangements?
That they were separate for these married couples, yes. The men slept collectively and the women slept separately, collectively. And they were... Collectively.
And
they were separate in general throughout life.
Which means that the superstructure of the ferry boat needed fewer partitions, did it not?
Sure, I get
Which
it.
means it was lighter.
And she describes, yeah, of course, fewer walls, less weight. But at the same time, she describes all the social activities where the men and women are entirely separate and like it that way.
Well, of course they did.
Now, I believe that, of
Who wants
course,
to be around a bunch of drinking, snorting, spitting men?
and of course that existed in Europe as well. But she seemed to be a part of that group of people who are the cosmopolitan cutting edge, where the happy middle class would have the educated males and females mingling together at a gallery exhibition or whatnot. And that just wasn't the case here in the States at the time. But what I was aiming at, and I wonder if I can get you to explicitly touch upon, is this idea that the superabundance of women with nothing to do, filled with sexual tension, and a society that has a tendency, oddly enough, balanced against like this debate we discussed, where it's possible for everyone to get together and talk about whether or not Christianity is malevolent, even in front of a crowd of Christians, and yet these same people would pretend shock and horror at the mention of the word corset. And so I see almost there the bones or the seeds of some of this social justice bullshit. Hordes of feminists acting as collective moral police, and in particular wishing to impose restrictions on language.
The women who did not have things to do. They didn't have to spin. They didn't have to weave. They didn't have to do this and that and the other. They were the first women who had servants. And that's something else your woman doesn't deal with.
Well, she does. She talks about the, servant, of course, at the time meant slave.
No, it did not.
Well, indentured servants were certainly slaves. And she remarked several times about trying to get help around the house in non-slave states. And everyone showed up with attitude and said they weren't no servant. But they'd be willing to help out. And
therein lies the difference.
For a little bit of money. And she also gets played by a couple of them who basically just take advantage of her naivete. By contrast, she discusses going to the slave states and how she actually lives well. Everything is ordered. You actually get service. Things are prepared well. And there's none of this business.
They're trained.
Well, yes. And you don't have to worry about the white people who look down upon the idea of being a servant to anyone, which seems to be a fundamental aspect of America at this time. Now, oddly enough, for all the pictures we paint today of slavery, I saw two interesting features that bear mention. The first is that she's talking about these, in Baltimore, she's listening to the black women outside her window who are fetching water from the pump or the well or whatever it is, and how they're singing and talking and laughing, and how they're also dressed in finery, like their relative finery, because they're out in public and they have beautiful dresses that they have made. Now this is household help, right? Not farm hands or working on a sugarcane plantation, but it doesn't sound so awful. And
well, that's because they were house servants.
And she mentions, let me just get this last one in there and I'll turn the whole picture over to you because you were going somewhere with the servant aspect. But she mentions that in a number of these revival events, she mentions the Negroes. And it's just gone by in passing. But these are certainly large areas that have been cleared out. But in the churches, certainly you're constrained by the amount of space within the building, so there can't be that much room for segregation. And she's describing Negroes being present at these revivals in the crowds or in adjacent crowds at a minimum. She doesn't specify. If we're so segregated and evil and awful, how was it that the same preachers came out to talk to the blacks and they were all present at the same time together in these rituals?
Are you done?
Yes, it would paint a rather different picture than we're given today, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, it would. It does. It was, in fact, different from what we were used to. Segregation as we know it didn't come around until after the Civil War. You see, it wasn't to be had. The main thing that you had with the Negroes and the theologically conversant individuals was that it took a while to get Negro preachers, black preachers. Now, once they had black preachers, things began to spiral off a bit. But until then, brother so-and-so, preacher such and such, right? These were for everybody. It doesn't take much to see that, for instance, if I'm a settler, that the people who settle with me, or the people whom I bring with me, are part of my family.
Yeah, you sink or swim together in a very literal sense.
Indeed so. And so you look to each other's well-being, in this. The condition of servitude had little to mark it once you got away from the major absentee landlord plantations. Yeah, there were some people who beat their slaves, but you would find them predominantly in the large areas, that is to say, the places of large agriculture, or the places where people would look down on you for beating your slaves. And it might be that something would happen to you of a late night. Yes. You see, the thing is that nobody enjoys the idea of beating someone except a sadist. And people realize this, and they don't want to put up with it. They do not wish to tolerate it around them. Now, on large agricultural plantations, no matter what their goods might be, or in large manufactories, then you could get away with it. You could get away with it whether they were your slaves or indentured servants or just somebody you hired.
Yeah, fresh off the boat. You talked about it before. There were laws requiring that you cared for your slaves in a certain way. They get care when they're sick, whereas, Irishmen fresh off the boat, if one dies, another one shows up in line the next morning at the factory.
Indeed so. On top of which you had not only Irishmen, but you had Czechs, Poles, all these people.
Yeah, Hungarians.
Yes, Hungarians. Now, the thing is that very few of those people came south. Very few. Mostly they were stuck with buying indentures for the southern plantations. A lot of the supposed black African graveyards they found are really Irish and English. The thing is that when you had, for instance, these women going around doing all of this nonsense, these were the women who first employed servants. Now, when I say employed, I mean employed, that is to say, paid them, all right? Now, these women were removed from the daily chores of life. C'est la vie. They didn't have anything to keep them busy.
Much like a liberal SJW from the middle class going to a place like Evergreen.
Yes. Now, when you got out into the countryside and you had all this orgiastic nonsense, you could just about count on 9 months later a whole bunch of strange pregnancies.
Yeah, she mentioned this one case where a traveling preacher comes to town and, all the young ladies really like him. And this one father puts his foot down because he can kind of smell it coming and says, you're out of my house. And if I see you around, you're out of this town. And She
Yep.
goes on to describe how it's 6 or 7 households, something that is so horrible it's unmentionable occurred. And the father was
Yes.
prudent in his. Yeah, so you get these. It's like that Flannery O'Connor story, good country people.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you see, there's also an awful lot of the farmer's daughter joke in this. You know. Yeah. The thing is that people, to be honest with you, Oliver, nobody talks about it anymore. But I will tell you what happened. What happens, I should say, with a lot of farm people. The two people would get together. The young man and the young woman would get together and would fuck. And they would not marry until and unless the young lady became pregnant. The reason for that being, there is nothing more useless to a farmer than an infertile wife. Now, that may seem harsh and cold and cruel in this day of John Deere tractors. But in the day that we're talking about, the more children, the better. This is why you see one man's tombstone surrounded by about, I don't know, 3 or 4 female tombstones and all kinds of little bitty
I was
tombstones.
about to say 12 or 13, for children, and most of them, you got a range of a few months or a few years they were alive. So at that point, it really
About 6 years.
it really mattered. But
Yep.
we are coming up on the time where we have to close this if I'm going to be able to render it.
All right.
My apologies.
That's all right.
For interrupting, but I wonder if as sort of a wrap up, you can tell us whether you think it's possible that any of these sort of dimensions of what's fundamentally American can be recovered or guarded or preserved or reintroduced in any way. I mean, are we just doomed to see all of this sort of disappear under a flood of ill-considered socialistic bullshit?
No, I see an awful lot of people from the flyover nation getting themselves together and deciding that they've had enough, in which case all of these immigrants and DACAs and all of these anchor babies are going to be swept up into a nice pan and thrown the fuck out because they don't matter.
Well,
And as they don't matter, it's time to clean house.
Well, I hate to not cut directly on that beautiful laugh, but just to tease this out for our other viewers, our next subject, I believe, will be DACA, anchor babies, and problematic, as they like to say, populations of one sort and another. So join us for the next upcoming clip.
Yeah.